Hello. Welcome. I'm going to be talking about Colony, or some part of Colony today. So before I start, I have to figure out how to change slides. There's an on-off and no. Oh, it's the other way. Okay. There we go. So I'm going to start with a very brief what is Colony. So Colony, you probably know, is a platform to organize work, to organize collaboration on projects on the blockchain. Our goals are for flexible hierarchies, meritocratic governance, and a lot of these topics we've talked about in the past at DevCon or past conferences. The big picture is that when you have people all over the world, we've got these great tools for cooperating. We have voice chats, video chats, text chats, emails, Slacks in the West, and those are great. But when it comes to collectively managing resources and finances, and things break down. So collective governance mechanisms, they're kind of still missing. And the hope is that maybe now with Ethereum and the blockchain, we could actually harness that power, get that missing ingredient to really form new forms of organization, new forms of work on a global scale. So in our white paper, which was released late last year, we sort of write down our vision of how that might look. This white paper describes in detail the smart contracts that will govern colonies, the tasks, the departments, the voting, the reputation system that I talked about at DevCon. But a lot of what's in here is sort of really describing the smart contracts, how they're going to work, and not so much why. So today I want to talk a little bit about the why, at least of part of this. So if we want to use the blockchain to achieve the goals I mentioned, the problems with the blockchain are, we all know them, blockchains are really slow. So for example, that means that if one click takes 17 or 30 seconds or so, that's a really sluggish interface, and nobody's going to use that unless they're really, really convinced that a blockchain is the best thing ever and they'll have to use it. So this is a problem when you try to onboard users from the Web 2 to Web 3. Also, blockchains are expensive. Every transaction costs money, real money, which people are not used to. So that's also a hurdle. So, and the result is we want to minimize transactions as much as possible. And that's not a Colony thing. That's goes for everyone in this space. So the general principle is you don't really go to the blockchain unless you have to. So one example is if you agree to buy me a beer after this talk, we don't have to go to the blockchain as long as two things hold. One of them is we have an agreement off-chain, and the other one is I can prove it off-chain afterwards if I have to, i.e. if you refuse to buy me a beer. I mean, this is a simplified version, but you'll recognize this is the main thinking behind payment channels, state channels, and all the rest. And the principle is important, so it's in bold. You only go on-chain if there's a dispute, not unnecessarily. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about voting and collective decision-making. People love to write about voting and talk about voting on the blockchain. You probably when people ask you what's a smart contract, you might even start, well, imagine a multi-sig and several people can suggest spending and then you vote on it and all the rest of it because it's an easy example to give. And I've certainly done that myself. We get interest from voting on like boardroom-style projects or liquid democracy folks, or even myself. I wrote an article on voting, and if you haven't read it, do go back and check that out. But why do we love to talk about voting? Well, because it's easy to understand, it's easy to explain, it's relatively easy to implement, and a lot of us think of collective governance and voting as really two sides of the same coin. They go together. Like we're collectively governing things means we're voting on things together somehow. But voting is not, a panacea. Panacea? I don't even know how to pronounce that. I've only ever read that. So, problems with voting. Voting is slow. You're going to need at least 24 hours voting period if you have a global DAO to allow for all the different time zones. And voting is expensive because all the transactions are going to have costs. And also, thinking about how to vote is expensive. You're going to have to look at what the question is, decide what you think the right answer is, and that is a lot of cognitive overhead and that's really expensive. Like people's thought is not something we can, can't just throw out votes to people and expect them to have an answer to all of them. So you really don't want to have people, don't want to force them to vote on things that they don't really have to vote on. So the general principle is, for a colony, permissiveness. Permissiveness means we only vote on-chain if there is a dispute. You don't vote on anything a priori. So you don't need to ask for approval. You don't need to wait for someone to assign you to a task. You just do. That's sort of the principle of permissiveness. There should be very little hurdle to activity, to doing things. So zooming in, the smallest part of a colony, of any collective work project, is going to be the unit of work, a task. This is a task in the colony protocol. A task is a smart contract, and it has several user accounts. It has an administrator, somebody who does administrative managerial duties. It has another description for the work to be done and a due date and some metadata perhaps. There's an evaluator account, which is the user account which is going to get asked to say, was the work done according to specifications? And there's a bounty, of course. There's the reward, which is locked in the smart contract, which gets paid out to the worker account if the evaluator agrees that the work was done, and so on and so forth. So this is sort of the smallest little unit we have to describe. And if you are the worker, and if you submit your work, and your work is accepted, then you get paid after 3 days. And it's this after 3 days I want to highlight, because that's one of to allow for the permissive nature, you need these delays all over the place, these security delays. So, what is a dispute? We want to balance two things in colony. We want them to be permissive, which means we want it to be easy to get things done, but we want it to be hard to cheat. And usually what that means is you can do things, but you don't need to apply for permission, so you could just do things. Let's say it should be easy to do things, and it should be hard to cheat means I shouldn't be able to create a task with a description, do nothing, assign a big bounty, assign the task to myself, submit it to myself, and run off with the money. And so what that means is the actions that we can do, they require some reputation and some tokens that need to be staked. Then there are security delays, and so, for example, well, when an evaluator accepts the work, as I said, there's a 3-day delay before paying out. And anyone who has enough reputation can object to anything that's going on. And I don't want you to think of objections as necessarily, I made that task that cheats by trying to pay me for doing nothing. It could just be something simple as, here, this is a duplicate task, should be deleted. So that's an objection. And once an objection is encountered, if nobody else does anything, fine, the objection holds, that task can be deleted. It is only when somebody else comes in and says, no, that objection is wrong, and I counter it, I insist we want to go the other way, it's at that point that there is a dispute, and it's at that point that we vote. So for a dispute to happen, you have to have people stake their reputation and tokens on both sides of a question, and then we have a reputation-weighted vote to resolve the dispute. And even then, we'll try to keep the disputes as local and as small as possible, because you don't want it to have excessive voting. But they can be escalated to a higher domain. I'm going to talk about these points in a minute. And the reputation system, deeply integrated in the voting and the incentives for the dispute system. I'm not going to talk too much about that today, because we covered that at DevCon. But let's look at this point here. Disputes are resolved as locally as possible. What does that even mean? So if we zoom out a bit, the structure of a colony, we've got domains, which you can divide a colony into. That is to divide a huge project into logical subunits, maybe departments, maybe working groups. So for example, here we've got a colony with a development domain, and the development has a Go, a C++, and a JavaScript subdomain. Each one of these domains will have its own budget, and within each domain there will be the tasks that get funded from that budget. And generally, when you do work in, let's say, the JavaScript domain, you will earn JavaScript reputation. That's local. Well, you will earn JavaScript reputation and development reputation and colony-wide. But when there's a dispute in the JavaScript department, it's only the JavaScript developers that get to vote on it at first. So we try to keep that as small as possible. So that's what I mean by that. So disputes can be escalated to a higher domain, but at extra cost, means the following, that if there is, let's say the JavaScript department is small and the reputation distributed within there is kind of lopsided, and there's one person who is aggressively trying to push one point of view that everyone else disagrees with, you can escalate to a higher department. So you can ask all developers to vote on this if you think that the department above, the development department, will agree with you. So you can't appeal to a higher boss, but you can appeal to a larger group of people. But there are risks. It's not, you don't just always escalate whenever a decision goes against what you thought just out of good luck, because there's strong incentives against doing so. You should only escalate if you really think that the rest of the colony will agree with you. And that takes us to this last point, the reputation gains and losses for disputes. So earning and losing reputation, I'm not going to talk a lot about, but I will I want to highlight one aspect of the system. So, okay, in general, yes, you earn reputation by doing good stuff, lose it by doing bad stuff throughout the colony. But one thing is, if you raise a dispute and the vote goes against you in a landslide, like everyone else votes against you, 90% to 10, let's say, then you're going to lose a lot of your stake tokens and reputations that you had to put up to get that vote to happen. Because you should be in communication with the rest of your team, with the rest of your colony. You should have known that everyone else disagrees with you. You're really encouraged to have communication out of bound. But if you do force a vote and you lose it by 51 to 49, your reputation penalty is much, much slighter, because probably it was a good idea to have an explicit vote because it wasn't so clear what everyone was thinking. Okay, so much for tasks. The funding system of the colony, I haven't talked too much in the past, so I'll highlight today, has a similar balance with permissiveness and security. So it should be easy to allocate funding. Even if a person just has a small amount of reputation, maybe you should be able to create a task and assign a big budget to it if that's what it needs, but it should require really long security delays so that if the rest of the colony does disagree, everyone has a chance to see what's going on, so you can't sneakily redirect funds. So again, we have a bunch of domains in a colony, and the general idea is we have a system of funding proposals where funding flows down this hierarchy. So at a certain rate, tokens get reallocated from a higher domain to a lower domain. And this rate depends on, for each of these spending proposals, depends on how much reputation is backing it. So the more reputation is backing a proposal, the faster the tokens flow downhill. And of course, for funding tasks, if you have a bigger bounty on the task, it'll require more time to fill, but if there's more reputation backing the proposal, it'll go faster. So that those two processes balance out the need for security and efficiency. So what we're aiming for is to have a steady and consistent allocation of funds to departments, to working groups, and to tasks, and mediated by sort of a reputation-weighted preferences. And that's the basic funding proposals, and they govern most or almost all of the day-to-day operations of a colony. There is another way of another funding proposal called priority funding proposal if you want to move funds elsewhere, if you have to pay an external source, if you quickly need to move a lot of funds, like those things can come up. But for that, we need a separate mechanism. A priority funding proposal can move funds between any departments or even out of the colony. There's no rate limitation, but they do require a vote before they pass, right? So that takes care of those. Finally, yes, a note on salaries. We always get asked about this sequence of task-based interactions. That's not really going to be how's that? That's not really going to work for all kinds of work. And it is possible to do things like salaried positions in a colony as well. In fact, many different forms of employment are possible. What the white paper describes is what happens on the blockchain. And the blockchain might only see domains and tasks, but that doesn't mean that when we have humans interacting with the applications that run on the colony protocol that you can't have salaries. So for example, a salary might be realized as a domain with only one member, so you own all the reputation in that domain, you control all the funds flowing into it, and you can always pay yourself out with a fake task whenever you want. So that would then, you know, if you have the right front end, just look like a salaried position, but on the blockchain it's just tasks and domains. And you can do other things as well. You can award people with reputation with fake tasks if everyone agrees. So the idea is, as long as there's consensus, we want to be flexible with the kind of things we allow. We need to be secure on a game theoretic level. So on the blockchain, it's really just these iterative tasks, but you know, a good front end can make a much more complex and interesting forms of employment. Yeah, and a note on this front end, we are releasing very soon our JavaScript library to our smart contracts that make it easy for anyone to experiment with building new applications that interact with the domains and tasks in the Colony system in general. Yeah, so what's been going on? We've had a beta. The Colony beta has been running for almost a year, and we've had a second beta starting last December, and it's been closed. That's why you haven't seen a lot of it. It's not been public, but it's been really successful in many ways. It's only a limited subset of what's in the white paper, so we don't have the decentralized governance features yet. It's just the tasks, the bounties, and you know, the automatic accounting on the blockchain, very basic subset, and a front-end application which is like task management with bounties that interacts with the smart contracts on a private network. And interesting to us, we had interest in the beta from all over, you know, the space, the usual suspects, the crypto startups, but also, interestingly, huge organizations thought they could use they'd have use for this, which I found interesting. And they all wanted some way of incentivizing work, farming out work to people, keeping track of who does what, and rewarding them in some way or other. And yeah, so they had use for this even without the decentralized governance. And what we learned is, well, it's hard to assign the value of a task up front, which didn't really surprise us at all. But for the game theoretic safety of the contract as we designed it, you need to have the bounty locked up that can be paid out when the task is finished. So you kind of do need to have that locked up in advance. However, we can imagine a system where you top up the bounties later in a nice front end, and on the back end is just a sequence of tasks. Again, what's on the blockchain doesn't have to be what you see. You know, so the tasks as a smart contract only have the bounty locked up front, but the front end can abstract that away. And yeah, the other thing we found is that the tokens that we were using were in a private testnet. They were worthless and meaningless. And so unless the employer explicitly was willing to exchange those tokens for ether or money or some other form of real value, then people weren't interested in working on the tasks. But that really didn't surprise us. I mean, that's basically what the incentive system of Colony is built on, this idea, right? The rewards. We need the rewards for people to be interested. And yeah, so for the huge organizations, the interest was they could flexibly assign work to a lot of people, and people within the organizations could flexibly pick up work in the system, and the system would automatically keep track of who does what, and that the flexibility was valued by the organization that could find unused talent within the organization or idle workers, and the workers benefit too because they can actually move beyond their immediate task set in their immediate department as long as they have time and skills. So this flexibility was valued on both sides, and so that was a good thing. Nice to learn. Not what I immediately thought as the first use case of Colony, but there you have it. The current status, well, the beta has been running and we've been incorporating the feedback of all our beta users. We have released our smart contracts. So if you go to this GitHub repo, you can actually deploy them yourself on your own network. You can play around with them. And the JavaScript library that makes it easy to run dApps on the system is also coming really soon. I was hoping to announce it today. Not quite ready, but very soon. That should make it easy for anyone to write dApps on top of the Colony network. We're at Colony. We are writing a dApp to interact with them, but we don't want to be the only one. We're not the gatekeepers, and you're more than welcome to experiment with the smart contracts and with the library to build your own apps. This is where you'll find more information at colony.io. You can sign up for the newsletter, and I know we've been kind of hidden in the last 2 years. We've been developing. We have had a closed beta. We haven't had a lot of big marketing blitzes and token sales, but we're now slowly decloaking after all this time. and we're looking for a lot of really interesting stuff happening in the next half a year, starting with the contract release, library release, and more coming, so do sign up. It's going to be a big year for us. Thank you.